Okay, another topic in the skeletal system, talking about fractures. Here are the standards and objectives. Pause, peruse. Okay, do you know what bones are broken most often? Any idea? Well, I'll tell you one. It's the clavicle, right here. Have you broken any bones? Well, I'll tell you me, I have. This is my left arm right here. I've broken this one twice, at age 2 and at age 6. Fractures are named in many ways. They can be named based on their external appearance. That's the first way. So it's either open or closed, or compound or simple. I don't know why they have so many terms, but anyway. Open means the bone breaks through the surface of the skin. That's called a compound fracture, like more complicated. A closed fracture makes sense. It doesn't break through the skin. It's also called simple. So if the bone breaks through the skin, we can call it either open or compound. So open because literally the skin is open, compound because it's more complicated. If the bone does not break through the skin, we call it closed, okay? Or simple, meaning not as complicated. And both times I personally broke my left arm, it was closed or simple. Fractures are also named based on their location. So some fractures are given specific names. So the pot fracture occurs from a badly sprained ankle, and it can include a fracture of the bones of the leg. And then we have a callus fracture. That's a break in the distal portion of the radius, and that's often due to breaking a fall. So you put your hands out and you can often get a callus fracture. Fractures are also named based on whether the broken parts line up correctly. So displaced or non-displaced. Displaced means the bones are not lined up. So here's the break in the bone, and they're like this. They're not pointing close to each other, which means they won't heal correctly. So the fractured ends of the bones are not in proper alignment, so you have to do something called a reduction and move those bones back into position. Sometimes that requires surgery. In the case, my son broke his thumb, and for the reduction, they gave a nerve block and then literally pulled the thumb like this, pulled it forward, slid it over, and put the bone back into position. Non-displaced means the fractured ends line up. They haven't shifted or moved out of position, so the bone is going to heal just fine. Which term describes a fracture that does not break the skin? That would be closed, remember, or simple. Which term describes a fracture where the broken ends are out of alignment? Displaced. Remember, you have to have a reduction to put them back in place. Fractures are also named by the nature of the break of the bone, and this may be what you are most familiar with. So we have a transverse fracture. So a transverse fracture is a break across the long axis of a bone. So now the interesting thing is that a transverse fracture can be open or closed, and it can be displaced or non-displaced. So there's lots of language we can use to describe the same fracture. So there's a transverse fracture. That's the tibia. There's a transverse fracture. Okay, that's the humerus. A spiral fracture is a break due to twisting motion. Okay, a twisting force along the long axis of the bone. So it can occur when a limb is planted. So you plant your foot and you twist. Okay, so it can happen in a lot of sports. It can also be a sign, unfortunately, of child abuse. Spiral fracture from twisting motion. Spiral fracture. So you see that jagged break because of a twist. Then we have comminuted fracture. That's where the bone is broken into more than 2 pieces. Comminuted fracture of the humerus. Ooh, comminuted fracture. That's the tibia and the fibula. A green stick fracture. That's common in children. The bone only breaks on one side. It bends. And that's because, remember, bones of children are not fully ossified. So there's a green stick fracture. You can see a fracture, a break on one side, but not the other. Green stick fracture. So you can see here clearly, break on this side, not broken on that side. So bends on one side, breaks on the other. A buckle or torus fracture is also common in children. The bone bends and bulges, it like buckles out, but it doesn't actually break. And usually this is due to a compression force. So jump too hard, fall too hard, okay? So literally the bone buckles out. So it's called a buckle or torus fracture. An oblique fracture is a break at an oblique angle across the bone. Transverse was straight across, oblique at an angle. Oblique fracture, that's of the tibia. Oblique fracture, I see the thumb over there, so that's the radius. A stress fracture is a small break, often caused by repetitive stress or overuse. So this can happen to like marathon runners, for example. A stress fracture. What type of fracture can be an indicator of child abuse? Spiral, unfortunately, remember, from a twisting motion. What type of fracture breaks the bone into more than two pieces? Comminuted, a lot of pieces. Well, more than two. What type of fracture breaks the bone across the long axis of the bone? Transverse fracture. How are fractures repaired? Well, 4 stages: hematoma, soft callus, hard callus, remodeling. Hematoma, blood clot. Some bone cells are going to die because the blood supply is going to be cut off by the clot. Okay. Second stage, soft callus. Forms hyaline cartilage is produced, forming a template, and it's formed on an internal callus and an external callus. Okay, so soft callus, it's going to have like a bulge on the outside. And then we get the hard callus. The osteoblasts are going to replace the cartilage with spongy bone. The bone is repaired. It's held together. It's linked up. But then in remodeling, which can continue for months to well over a year, depending on the severity of the fracture, the compact bone is going to replace the spongy bone and make it more durable. Over time, it's going to become less noticeable. But if you've had a fracture, your skeleton will tell a story, okay, so that someone will be able to tell when they look at an x-ray. So when my oldest child broke their collarbone in delivery, when we went for a check at the pediatrician, they felt for that soft callus, then later felt for the hard callus. They felt for that bump forming. Over the years, that bump kind of gets remodeled. The bone looks more like the one that wasn't broken, but your x-rays will still tell a story that you had a broken bone. Which stage of fracture healing happens after the hematoma? Soft callus. So it's hematoma, soft callus, hard callus, remodeling. Hematoma, soft callus, hard callus, hematoma. And that's fractures. Some information is a little tough to process, but hopefully you learned something new today.